What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Today I want to talk to you about Dragonflight by Anne McCaffrey. This is about a 300-page book, quite a bit shorter than the first Game of Thrones book, which I read before reading this, so this was a breeze to get through compared to that. But this is a science fiction sort of slash fantasy story. This book is pretty much just a fantasy story, but in the opening introduction, it talks about how humanity left Earth and colonized other worlds, and they genetically engineered and created these creatures that were very similar to dragons of myth. And so this story is basically just human beings and dragons and castles and different political wars of sorts. So it all feels very much like it comes right out of a fantasy novel. But I believe some of the later books in this series, and there are several books in this series by this author, some of the later books are going to have a little bit more of a science fiction bent to them. I believe one of them even had a spaceship on the cover, but this one is pretty much just a fantasy story. And this book feels like it is a partial story. Whenever I got to the very end of this book, I felt like there were a few chapters missing, and that is unfortunate because I really did enjoy what we were given here, but I didn't feel like we were given everything. This feels like, and I don't know if this is true, but it feels like Anne McCaffrey decided that she was going to do this big, long franchise, and so she was going to kind of stretch things out a little bit, and they weren't going to wrap everything up in the first book. That's kind of what it feels like, and I don't know if that's true, but there's a lot that I feel like still needs to be answered by the end of this book, and I won't get into all that. I am going to be spoiling some stuff from this book, but this is like a 50-year-old novel, so I don't think it's going to be a big deal if I throw some spoilers out there. But this book, it introduces an incredibly convoluted and interesting mythos for this world, but I feel like it thinks that that's enough. It doesn't quite give us enough of a story, and it does give us a whole lot on the two main characters. It really does a good job of developing these two main characters and kind of showing how they fit into this larger world, but I really do feel like it needs more of the actual conflict that these characters are going through. And there's multiple different kinds of conflict. There's man versus man versus nature, and man versus self. And you've got a lot of man versus man here, mostly just small antagonistic stuff between the two major characters and also between other characters who are living at the same castle, but you don't have a whole lot of man versus nature, which is kind of what I was expecting, because this book spends a whole lot of time talking about the red star, and whenever this planet gets kind of closer to the red star every like 300 or 400 years, the threads are coming, and the threads are basically these it's kind of like a plague that comes and destroys the crops on this world, and it happens every 300 or 400 years, and they spend a lot of time hyping that up, and then at the end of the book it's like, okay, let's take our dragons and let's go fight the threads, and then it just stops. And I was really expecting a little bit more about that. I was expecting more of a conclusion to the man versus nature stuff, but it really kind of skimps on the man versus nature stuff, but it gives us a whole lot on the man versus man, and maybe just a tiny bit on the man versus self stuff. But you got your two main characters. Flar is a dragon rider of Pern, and his father was the dragon master at Pern, and then when his father died, it's not a title that you inherit, you have to fight for it. You have to send your dragon out, and then there's the queen, and then the queen dragon, she is bonded to this woman who kind of telepathically talks to her. Every rider is telepathically bonded to their dragon, and so everyone sends out their dragon to try and mate with the queen, and therefore be the dragon master of the castle, and then you're basically in charge of everything at that castle. And that is something that Flar tried to do when he was a teenager when his father died, and then it didn't work out. There was another guy who became the Dragon Master, and now that the previous queen has died, and the dragon woman, I don't remember what her title is, but the basically the woman who's bonded to the queen dragon, after she's died now, Flar and all these other riders have to go to these other smaller castles all over the planet and bring all these women back to Pern, or the main castle, to try and decide who's going to be the next woman who's going to bond with this next queen dragon. And that woman is Lessa, who is part of a previous royal family who lived at this one castle, and all of her family was exterminated, and she is very unlikable. And I feel like McCaffrey was thinking, okay, I'm going to give her a very tragic backstory where her entire family was exterminated and she lives as a slave in this place and has been raped several times, and I'm going to give her this really sad backstory, and that will make everyone like her. And unfortunately, I do feel for her based on all this stuff that's happened to her, but she also does some really horrible stuff throughout this entire book. She kills an innocent woman trying to politically maneuver everybody so that she can benefit and she can be in charge of this castle, and it's very difficult for me to forgive her for that, because even though the book tells us that she feels bad about that, I don't see it. She still continues to do a lot of behind-the-scenes manipulation and maneuvering to try and make things work out for her, even though we have seen that that led to an innocent woman's death. And it doesn't seem like she's as interested in protecting the realm as she is advancing herself politically in this world. And so Lessa is incredibly difficult to sympathize with. And unfortunately, I feel like we are going to be seeing a lot of her in these future books. We do see her a lot in this. She's one of the two new Dragonists. And then you also have Flar, who I talked about a little bit already. He becomes the new Dragon Master in this book, and he's also flawed, but it's a little bit easier to sympathize with him because even though he can be very arrogant and confident and cocky and all of the above, he's always right. Whenever he says something is going to happen, it does happen. He is one of the main ones who's talking about the threads are coming, the red star is getting brighter, and everyone else says, you know, that hasn't happened in decades. Pretty much all of society in this book has gotten lazy, and Flar is like, you know, if I had been the Dragon Master whenever I tried when I was a teenager, then nobody would have gotten this lazy and we would have been prepared for the threads coming. And so Flar, he's very stone cold. He doesn't really put his emotions out there that often, and that makes it a little bit difficult to kind of sympathize with him, but you understand why he does it, because he's trying very hard to kind of do what Lessa does, but do it in a little bit more of a sympathetic way, where he's trying to maneuver things so that the entire kingdom doesn't just fall apart, because the threads are coming, and if they come, and if they're not destroyed, then everyone is going to die. And so he's kind of sort of doing the same thing that Lessa is doing, and they're both doing it for the greater good, but it doesn't feel like Lessa is doing it for the greater good when she does it. But anyway, this book does not necessarily feel like it's a whole story. It feels like it's only part of a story. They spend so much time talking about the threads and the red star that whenever they get to the end of the book, it's like, okay, let's take our dragons and let's go fight the threads and destroy them. And I'm thinking, okay, that's it? There's not like more to this story? And there are a bunch of sequels, and I feel like Anne McCaffrey, maybe when she was writing this, maybe she felt like she could get some sequels out of this, so she didn't wrap everything up here. There's especially a subplot with Flar's half-brother Fëanor that is just kind of dropped, and I'm assuming it will be picked up in a sequel, but it's not wrapped up in this book. And there's a little bit of that where I feel like everything just kind of abruptly stops. It doesn't wrap everything up like I would want it to. And you can wrap everything up. You can make this feel like a complete story, and you can do a sequel. You don't have to leave a whole bunch of stuff hanging just to do a sequel. You can do a sequel and make the first story feel like a complete story, and I don't really feel like this one does. And it's hard to explain what I mean other than saying there's different subplots that are just kind of unceremoniously dropped, and right before the big final conflict where they try and destroy all the threads, it just kind of ends the book right there. But this book is really good, really interesting. I am going to read more. I'm very fascinated with the mythos of this book. I like the characters, and it's not to say that the characters have to be extremely likable and they have to be characters that you want to hang out with, because Lessa is not likable. She's not someone I would want to hang out with, but she's a very interesting character, and that is something that a lot of times stories fail at. They will try and make a character that you want to root for them, but you maybe they just don't work in that way. And I feel like Anne McCaffrey, she does make me want to root for Lessa sometimes, and then sometimes I'm thinking, come on, just stop being the way that you are. But anyway, those are my very scrambled thoughts on Dragonflight, the fantasy novel. I hope that you guys liked this video, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back later this week with another video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.